Chapter 7. Faith Against Swords. The conference of 1775 met, as had those of the 2 previous years, in St. George's Church, Philadelphia. The day of opening, May 17th, fell exactly 1 week later than the date of the opening of the Second Continental Congress, which had convened in Liberty Hall. It is not likely that the patriots who sat in that first capital of the nation knew of the presence of a handful of lay preachers in conference so near their own chamber. The thoughts of the publicists were concerned with stamp acts, taxation, the rights of the colonies, and limitations of the royal government. War had not been declared against the mother country, but hostilities had already begun. The Battle of Lexington having occurred in the preceding April. I don't think I've been into any Lexington, but there's a whole series of Lexingtons. The land was filled with rumors of the coming strife, and the minds of the people were heavy with apprehensions. The first war note found in Asbury's journal is in an entry made on April 30th, 1775, 20 days before the meeting of the conference. In this entry he says, "We have alarming military accounts from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Surely the Lord will overrule and make these things subservient to the spiritual welfare of the church." There were then no steam mail lines, no daily papers, no telegraphs, nor telephones. The news traveled slowly and multiplied itself at each stage of advance. Boston Harbor and the foot of Bunker Hill were then the scenes of military activity. But Boston was a long way from the center of the Methodist world. Northern New Jersey, or perhaps southern Connecticut, was at this time the farthest northward range of any of the itinerants. Amid the cry of tidings, some true, some exaggerated, the preachers in connection with the Reverend John Wesley, many of whom were loyal British subjects, had ridden to their gathering in the city, soon to become the birthplace of American liberty. The conditions were depressing to all, but to none more than to Rankin, who in his journal notes the effect upon the conference. But one, at least, of the British brethren was calm and undisturbed, wherever the prophecy conveyed to him by the disjointed lines. By the disjointed times. Well, prophecy really should be reserved to something in terms of a being spiritually gifted, not, that was Francis Asbury, who from the first seems to have made up his mind to stay with the Americans and share their fate. And all the entries in his journal, which touch upon the war, he did not once betray a partisan spirit. Whether in England or in America, he had but one fealty, and that was to the kingdom of heaven. There, however, came a time when he felt and could express pride in being a citizen of the Republic. At the conference, a day of prayer and fasting was appointed for the prosperity of the work and for the peace of America. The year then closing had witnessed a great ingathering 3,148 members in society were reported, and 19 preachers were given appointments. Asbury was appointed to labor in Norfolk, Virginia. There were no signs of a renewal of the conflict of judgment between him and Rankin, impressed as they no doubt were with the gravity of the experience through which the infant church was clearly foredoomed to pass. They laid aside their differences and worked together in a spirit of concession. It is probable, too, that the appointments were made after a very full discussion and open conference of the effect upon the work of the existing and threatened condition of public affairs. Rankin says in his journal, "We conversed together and concluded our business in love. We wanted all the light and advice we could obtain respecting our conduct in the present critical situation of affairs. The strained relations between Asbury and Rankin ended with this conference, and there seems to have been much confidence and a real warmth of brotherly feeling between them from this time to the end of Rankin's stay in the country. No doubt Rankin came to a more correct appraisement of Asbury's ability, and Asbury in turn found that his superior was neither so obdurate nor so overbearing as he had at first suspected. It is the old story of human limitations, within which the acts of even holy apostles have sometimes been found blameworthy. Methodism was introduced into Norfolk and Portsmouth in 1772 by Robert Williams, an irregular Wesleyan preacher, who preceded Boardman and Pilmer to America by some months. He was one of the most interesting characters of the early Methodist era, zealous, impetuous, passionately religious, and rudely eloquent. His prophecy was burdened with a cry against the worldliness of the priests of the established church. He was an anti-hierarchical zealot, a Republican. The political party didn't exist back then, but and the embodiment of gospel self-abnegation. SPQR is what I'm talking about. And yet he was an enigma to the world and to his brethren. Ignorant of how to submit to discipline, he labored with marvelous results. Utterly dead to the world, he yet understood beyond all the men of his fellowship how to use the world as not abusing it. He printed books and sold them while sweeping around his wilderness circuits, and toward the end of his remarkable career he married and left at his death an estate considerable enough to be administered upon. He was, as the history of the early itinerants goes, the first of the preachers to print a book, the first to marry, and the first to die. The supreme distinction of his life, however, is that of being the spiritual father of Jesse Lee, the apostle of Methodism to New England. For a preaching place in Portsmouth, Williams had secured a vacant store, and for a chapel in Norfolk, an abandoned playhouse. He had also gathered a small society, but the population was up to rate, and no extraordinary headway had been made previous to the time of Asbury's coming. From the miracles that had attained his ministry at Baltimore, at the Point, and amongst the plantations in Maryland, Asbury found himself transferred to conditions upon which even the fiery zeal of Williams had but feebly told, but he was nearing his 30th year, and to a rich experience was adding the judgment and mastery of maturity. To his difficult task he addressed himself with purpose. The handful of members which he found in society were soon reduced a half by the application of discipline, for which he always stood. This done, he began a characteristic move upon the adjacent coasts and the wide region westward and northward of the Twin Ports. The circuit covered the country lying between the Dismal Swamp and the great estuary, and as far northward as he had time and strength to ride. What had been difficult to Williams, under happier conditions, became all but impossible to Asbury. With the fever of war consuming the souls of the people, politics and unbelief, when mingled, make a refractory composition. But the man of faith, hungering for holiness and peace and for human souls, went on with his work. Like a true captain, when the opposition seemed strongest, he ordered an advance. A subscription for building of a chapel was set on foot, but the utmost that could be secured was 35 euros. Liras? That's liras, right? How faint a prophecy that of modern Methodist Norfolk, with its many and costly churches. About midsummer of this year, Thomas Runkin, for himself and others of the English preachers, notified Asbury on account of the growing enmity to loyal British subjects in the revolted provinces. He judged it best for them to return at an early day to England. To this communication, Asbury returned a prompt and vigorous answer to the effect that, whatever Runkin and others chose to do, he himself was determined to remain with the flock in America. This courageous stand of the former general assistant caused Runkin to change his mind for the time. His departure from the continent was thus postponed for 2 years. A notable revival had been in progress in Virginia prior to 1775. It had begun under the ministry of the Reverend Devereux Jarrott, a priest of the established church, who had affiliated with the Methodists and used their methods, even organizing societies for the training of converts. In 1773, Robert Williams joined himself to Jarrott, and the revival took on extraordinary proportions. Then came George Shadforth, whom Wesley had sent to America with a commission to publish his message in the face of the sun. And the Pentecostal circle widened from district to district and from county to county. Nothing like it had been seen in America before, and it was this awakening in Virginia which accounts for the extraordinary growth of the Methodist societies between 1775 and 1776. In fact, the impetus of it was felt in Methodism for half a hundred years later. The Brunswick Circuit was the center of this noteworthy movement, and George Shadforth was assistant in charge. In October, provided with a chaise, Asbury said farewell to Norfolk. And drove southward to Brunswick to join Shadforth. Weather he went by appointment of Runken or by invitation to Shadford does not appear. Bishop McTyrie describes his absence as a vacation. If so, it was a vacation from which he never returned. The state of war had greatly interfered with an ordinary administration of conference affairs. Many of the preachers were under the necessity of becoming a law unto themselves. Well, think if we all were like that, though. That if we just connected ourselves to reasons and took full responsibility of our own system of judgment. This was particularly true of those itinerants in the coast cities exposed to invasion or bombardment. British Marines had already landed at Norfolk, and soon after Asbury's departure, the city was burned by order of the Tory governor of Virginia. Asbury had no immediate successor, and the circuit does not again appear in the list of appointments until 1777. Yeah, there's a lot of churches that went under during the Civil War. I mean, were burned or something. So there's reason why it's hard to find pre-like 1784 churches in America on the East Coast. Although the switching of church leaderships and stuff like this, people going from one church to another, plays as big of a role as any. During the 4 succeeding months, Asbury was within the revival circle in the interior. It was remote from the scenes of incipient war. The land was populous. The work of God was prospering, as he desired it should in every place. And the soul of the visiting itinerant went out in a glow. Now, let's remember there's a huge difference between what you desire to be your work for God and what God actually has as your work, or what considers the best work. He rode from revival to revival. At a certain quarterly meeting where he preached, 700 people were reckoned to be present. This meeting licensed 3 preachers who afterwards became distinguished in the history of Methodism. They were Francis Poythress, James Foster, and Joseph Hartley. Sometime after this, Asbury visited the Reverend Mr. Jarrett, the evangelical Anglican, who had been so largely instrumental in promoting the Virginia revival. The two held several meetings together, and for years afterwards, they were united in the closest bonds of friendship and confidence. Some time later, when the societies and preachers were without proper superintendency on account of the long continuance of the war, they were by action of conference recommended to seek advice of this godly and evangelical priest. Several of the early Methodist historians refer to him as the American Fletcher, and the designation in view of his spirit and zeal is not inapt. About this time, a letter came from Runkin directing Asbury to repair to Philadelphia, and again to assume charge of the societies in that war-troubled center. After giving some time to administrating upon the will of his lately deceased fellow itinerant, Robert Williams, he set off for Philadelphia by the way of Baltimore. For the next few months, his journal constantly records rumors of an impending conflict. A great army was expected to arrive from England in the spring, and feverish preparation was being made by the colonies to resist. No conjecture could be risked as to where the chief attack would be delivered, and so every exposed community suffered from disturbing and distressing apprehensions. To add to the distress of the work and the embarrassment of the preachers, Mr. Wesley's ill-advised, calm address to the American colonies had made its appearance. The immediate effect was to put the whole body of the Methodists under the suspicion of disloyalty and raise against the preachers, English and native, the cry of Tory. The copies of the address sent to Rankin were summarily burned. But the interested Tory government found a way to smuggle others in. The confusion wrought by this pamphlet cannot be appreciated at this distance. Rankin read the logic of it, and, at the conference held that year, left himself without an appointment. That he might be able to go generally over the field to allay suspicion and preach down resentment, or, if so extreme a need should arise, that he might be free to leave the country at a moment's notice. The conference met in Baltimore, in the newly opened Lovely Lane Chapel, on the 21st day of May, 6 weeks before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Asbury was not at the conference, having been seized on his way thither with a severe illness and a recrudescence of former malarial poisonings. Feeble, but not despondent, he made his way back to Philadelphia and awaited the return of his northern brethren to bring him news from the conference, when the fraction of 5,000 members reported in society and 24 preachers received appointments. Among the names of those admitted on trial into the traveling connection appears that of freeborn Garretson, the avant courier of early Methodism. Varied were the types of gifts, zeal, and heroism in the company of the itinerants that led the Wesleyan movement in North America, but of that immortal guard no name retains a surer luster, nor begets a more certain inspiration than that of freeborn Garretson. As in the previous year, the conference finished its proceedings with the resolution appointing a day of fasting and prayer for the peace of America. In his sick chamber at Philadelphia, Asbury received the information that he had been appointed assistant in charge of the Baltimore work. This was his fourth assignment to that circuit. Beyond a doubt, the news was a solace to him. Weak and wasted with long and frequent sicknesses, he rode southward to that haven of rest and earthly happiness, Perry Hall, where his friends, the Goths, received him with tender affection and attended him with tireless ministries. In returning to Maryland, he naturally felt that he was returning to his own, but a foretaste of the sore experience he was to pass through during the next few years awaited him. The new political order was asserting itself vigorously. Asbury had failed to take out a civil license as a preacher. For this neglect, perhaps, he was wholly ignorant of the necessity of such a license. He was arrested and fined £10. The rule, an old and inoperative one, had been revived, with a view to limiting the loyalist propensities of the priests of the state church. The fact that Asbury was an Englishman suggested to the colonial police the desirability of putting him under the rule. After about 3 weeks of active work in Maryland, during which time he was more than once exposed to drenching rains, a malignant sore throat, the result of malarial poisoning, long uncorrected, prostrated him and brought him near to death. Now, licenses to lead prayers and preach and stuff like this, the government should have no role in that sort of, thing, who's allowed to and who's not. Now, people are, know more than others, and maybe they should lead prayers, but that, it was now decided by his friends, the Goths and the Lums, that he must take a vacation, strange sound to him, and go to the warm sulphur springs in Virginia for his health, even for the saving of his life. It was midsummer, and the Goths and the Lums were soon to go thither on their annual outing. Having made provision to supply his circuit, Asbury set forth with his friends on the journey to the springs. That no opportunity might be lost, sick and shattered in frame though he was, he ventured to preach twice in Baltimore, and at night in the tavern at which he stopped the second day. A great company was found at the springs, a field white unto harvest, as he fondly hoped, and so he arranged a meeting each evening for preaching and exhortation, in the cottage of Mr. Goff, or in some others that he found open. In addition to this, he preached 3 times each week, and once on the Sabbath in the open air. Well, not the biblical Sabbath, but Sunday, I'm sure. At this time, also, his daily reading did not fall short of the accustomed 100 pages, a task, this, for an invalid, and yet, to him, it was rest, soul-restoring rest. Moreover, his health improved steadily. Nor was he without a variety of instructive and edifying experiences outside of his routine. He met not a few of such people as are usually attracted to such a resort, people of means, leisure, and intelligence of a sort, but possessed of freakish religious notions. He describes with some severity 2 spiritless sermons which he heard, and a conversation which he had with an antinomian. Serious man that he was, he had a keen sense of the ridiculous and was quick to detect a sham. Nor was he slow to expose it, at least in his journal. After 6 weeks of active resting at the springs, with reinvigorated blood and fiber, he was back in Maryland, preaching to great crowds at many of the rural stations, and witnessing a general ingathering of converts. The result of the year for all Maryland were, in round numbers, little short of 1,000 additions to the members in society. Constant tidings of the continued revival in Virginia also cheered him and his fellow workers. The evangelism of the period was contagious. A wave of spiritual power seemed to be steadily rising in the 2 colonies. With these tokens about him, and with constant access to his confiding and helpful friend, Otterbein, there was now but one thing to give Asbury happiness, and that was the ever-deepening cloud of war that hung about the land. Near the end of February, leaving Joseph Hartley in charge of the Baltimore stations, he rode through blinding snows to open a new work in Annapolis, the capital. The new state assembly was in session, flushed with the pride of recently declared independence, and confident in the thought of nationality. The town was notoriously irreligious, being a hotbed of typical 18th century deism. The young itinerant aimed at nothing short of evangelization of this place. It was a Herculean undertaking, but it was a spiritual Hercules who undertook it. Eventually, not a few of the members of the assembly attended upon his ministry. By the middle of spring, a pronounced impression had been made upon the whole body of the people. When he delivered his last sermon, preparatory to reporting to the conference, a notable congregation waited upon his message and importuned him to return.